and good evening to all of those joining us online, virtually, and good afternoon to everybody here. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we're gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And it's great to see a really big audience here. I know it's after lunch and it's a really hot day, so I thought people might have gone back to have a nap, but thankfully you all have shown up. So thank you for attending, kind of thing. I'm really honored to be here today to talk about building back better. But I have to say, I confess, I don't have the answers in terms of how we build back better. And instead, similar to what Veronica so eloquently put, is just my reflections and observations on the last 2.5 years. And I'm going to be talking about three main things. I'm going to be talking about three main things: how COVID-19 changed the world, what are the challenges in the new normal, and how do we build back better? And I hope that while I'm talking, it also gives everybody a chance for the next 30 minutes, I promise I won't talk too much, to kind of reflect and pause, to take this opportunity to actually think of these three things. And as I'm saying, and then afterwards you can come and argue and say I was completely wrong. I'm fine with that kind of thing. So we know COVID-19 changed the world. Anyone who says it didn't, clearly was living under a rock. So this is Champs-Élysées in Paris, and it was taken during the lockdown. Anybody who's ever been to Paris knows that usually it is full of people, full of cars. Just want to reflect back to 2.5 years ago, more like New Year's Eve 2019. As we were all partying, dancing, popping champagne, did any of us here imagine that there was a pandemic about to come around the corner? That was brewing, and our lives, our world was about to change. Like when we look back, I don't think any of us could have imagined that the next 2.5 years were going to look the way they did. And the irony being, on 1st of January, on New Year's Day in 2020, the Chinese authorities closed down the Wuhan seafood market due to an outbreak of unexplained pneumonia cases. So it was still undetected, not many of us knew it, but 3 months later, by March, 1/3 of the global population was in some form of lockdown. So that is 1/3 of all people across the world were in some form of lockdown. Borders were closed, airports were shut, schools were abandoned, streets were empty, we were all confined to our homes, we had to spend a lot of time with our family members. And I think that was the beginning of the pandemic. And now we're all getting back to the new normal. But it's time to reflect in terms of what has happened in those 2.5 years, or maybe a bit more than 2.5. I think the statistics are quite grim, and this was from last week, as at August 8th. 6.4 million people have died from COVID, and 583 million confirmed cases of COVID. And we know this is an underestimate, because this is confirmed cases and confirmed deaths. And looking at these official statistics alone, COVID-19 was the 4th leading cause of death globally in the last 2.5 years. And once we start doing the unreported deaths, that death toll is 17 million people died from COVID-19 in the last 2.5 years. And it slots to the 2nd leading cause of death globally. That is, 1 out of every 10 deaths around the world was due to COVID-19. And this is the first time in decades, and I think it's more than 2 or 3 decades, somebody else might be able to correct me, that a single infectious disease is in the top 5 global causes of death. And so this is in terms of how COVID has changed the nature of disease and health. But I'd like to also talk about some of the other social changes. And they were, in my opinion, could be I'm definitely wrong, but in my opinion, my observations, I think there are 6 key trends that have happened socially due to COVID and how the world has changed. I think COVID exposed the myth of rugged individualism. We are not self-sufficient. We are not independent. We never have been. Our fates are bound together. Taking care of others is taking care of ourselves. Now, anthropologists have long recognized that exceptionally high degrees of sociality, cooperation, and communal care are hallmarks of humankind. It's not seen in any other species. And this interdependence on each other has been our key to success as a species. In a way, you can say, we have an evolutionary mandate to be generous and to take care of each other. But unlike early humans who lived in comparatively small groups, we cannot just rely on our immediate family and friends for support. We need policies, we need our communities, our wider communities, we need global communities of communal care. And what's come across during the pandemic was communities that prioritized the group over the individual fared better in the pandemic than the communities who didn't, who kept thinking that individualism was the way to go. And I think that's quite an important concept, is there is no such thing as individualism when it comes to humankind. The second trend, the pandemic hurt some groups more than others. I think it inflamed old fault lines. So these weren't new, they were old fault lines of racism, nationalism, colonialism, economic exploitation, and other structural inequalities in ways that have a deep impact. They revealed them and they deepened them. As Veronica said, data from across the globe shows that Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities were and are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And she told us those shocking statistics. And it was not just in the US, it was right across the world. And it's clear, it's not a medical explanation. There is a social reason behind it. We had the jobs, the Indigenous, the Black, and Brown communities across the world had the jobs that exposed us to infections, the comorbidities that made us more likely to get very sick and less likely to access good quality healthcare. The toll revealed in very stark ways that disparities and racism is alive and well in all of our countries. At the same time, people were attacking African Americans in the US, and those attacks were being disseminated far and wide via new visual technologies. And just as COVID laid bare the racial disparities, the murder of George Floyd unfolded in front of millions of eyes in a way that made racial oppression undeniable. And it was not just showcased in the US, it was right across the world. And in a way, it showed that structural racism was displayed in all of its hideousness. But people, for the first time, were dissecting and debating it globally across social media in a way that has never been possible before. I think pretty much there was a Black Lives Matter march in almost every single country across the world. My third trend, it revealed the fragility of our institutions. Across the globe, the pandemic showed us how fragile our health systems really are, how fragile our democracies are, and even our global supply chains collapsed during the pandemic. Anybody who was waiting for their Amazon delivery can attest to that, or when food disappeared. So it shows us that our institutions are very fragile. But what it also showed was how quickly some of these started collapsing, even in the world's richest countries. I think the irony is in Australia, when we saw the hospital systems collapsing in Europe, that's when we went into action. I think before that, we always thought, oh, we'll be able to handle it. This is an LMIC issue. They will struggle, not high-income countries. But looking at that collapse, especially in Italy, was basically when all the rules changed, the borders shut, everything happened very quickly. So I think it showed us that our institutions and health systems are very fragile. But it also showed that the trust in institutions, the health system, and government is fading. People feel ignored. Our communities feel ignored. The growing inequalities over the decades have marginalized people, and after this have left a lot of them further behind. And these exclusions feed the distrust, feed the cynicism in institutions, feed the misinformation and disinformation we see. The lack of transparency in public decision-making or accountability of government or public officials is further eroding people's trust. I know it's been quite a, so far I've been just looking at the bad stuff kind of thing. So I promise some of the good stuff. There was also some good things that came out of the pandemic. I would say the emergence of high-speed scientific hive mind, I would like to call it. Now, for most of the time, science is slow and tedious business. But as researchers and scientists, we love it. We don't care. It's slow and tedious, but it is, let's face it. But the scale of scientific cooperation and collaboration during the pandemic is staggering, if you think about it. And how quickly it moved and how effectively it moved. So just to give you some context, in 2019, December 30th, unbeknownst to anyone else, because everybody else was planning their New Year's Eve parties, Epidemiological Surveillance Network published a very short English language note about a cluster of pneumonia cases of unknown cause in Wuhan, China. A week later, it was identified as a novel coronavirus. A few days after that, the full genome sequence was published online. In mid-January, the WHO published instructions for a PCR-based diagnostic test based on that genome. That genome sequence opened the door for vaccine development, and within a year, there was an effective vaccine, an mRNA-based vaccine, which was developed, tested, and distributed in less than a year. And to think that in early December 2019, no scientist had ever seen the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So when we put our heads together, we can accomplish great things. And I'm pretty sure everyone here, including myself, wish we bought shares in Zoom back in 2019, or MS Teams, or we created an online platform because we would all be millionaires kind of thing by now. I think what the pandemic did was it forced a remote work experiment, a remote learning experiment globally. All of a sudden, our homes were converted into our offices. It was where we did our work, where we taught children, where we learned, where we attended conferences, and where we even did yoga kind of thing. It all was from one space kind of thing. It was all in our homes. And it turns out that estimates suggest that about 40% of the global working population worked from home. I think before the pandemic, it was around 3 to 5% could work from home, like on a full-time basis, but during the pandemic, 40%. What this tells us that work will never be the same. With a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reimagine everything about how we do our jobs, how we learn, how we run our organizations. And my last observation is it raised the value of community solidarity. So I'm a big movie buff, and one of the things I enjoy watching is apocalyptic movies. So that's I'm sharing that out there. And one of these movies you watch, the apocalyptic movies, be it a disease, zombies, environmental disaster, you name it. In every single one of those movies, people turn on each other. It's every person for itself. People shoot, kill, steal, kind of thing. But Hollywood got it wrong, because by and large, this was not the experience of the pandemic. Yes, we saw the fights over toilet paper in the supermarket aisles and car parks. I think pretty much every single country had that kind of thing. So we saw that. But there was also a lot of people helping each other. Community action sprang across the world as neighbors, communities, schools, individuals worked together to meet the needs of vulnerable people, and everybody was sharing resources. And even people from across the world were trying to share resources if they could. Neighboring countries were doing that. But solidarity comes in many forms. So we've seen all the community solidarity. We saw the pictures, we saw the media coverage. But sometimes you think that a global crisis might be the catalyst that teaches us what is possible if what we choose to prioritize. For example, in Italy, the government canceled all mortgage payments during the lockdown. Spain nationalized all its hospitals and healthcare providers. In El Salvador, the government canceled all rent, water, phone, internet, and electricity bills for 3 months. In France, all taxes, rent, and utility bills were canceled for a year. In Australia, the government housed homeless Australians in hotels, eradicating homelessness for several months. So it's a thing about what we can do things if we have the will and prioritize community, as well as both from a community point of view and a government point of view. Because governments generally tend to do what their people want them to do. Because we do vote for them. So as we're returning to a new normal, so we've had 2 years of online conferences, 2 years of closed borders, 2 years of online learning, 2 years of working from home. We are kind of shifting to this new normal. But there's some challenges that still face. And I'm going to talk about, I've chosen these 4 challenges in the new normal that we as a health system, we as everybody in this room have a part to play. And the first one, which I think is very close to a lot of people in this room, is an exhausted health workforce and a fragmented health system. The pandemic has battered the healthcare infrastructure all around the globe. The doctors, the nurses, the community healthcare workers, the healthcare staff have plunged themselves in the line of fire to keep the population safe and alive. And there is no sight of the pandemic ebbing. Case numbers are still going up. There's other diseases that were put on hold, and the patient load is still continuing up. Combat fatigue has set in our workforce. The very people whose life mission is caring for others are on the verge of collective collapse, physically and emotionally. I don't think any health worker anywhere in the world has emerged unscathed from the pandemic. Our experience of the pandemic has been very different from the rest of the population. We've had to watch wave after wave of very sick people struggle and die. Many fell ill themselves, and some of my colleagues have burnt out and left the profession, and some have taken early retirement. We were harassed by anti-mask and anti-vaccine protesters, and some could not wear their uniforms because they were spat at. Apologies. And now we've got an exhausted and depleted health workforce struggling to provide timely, necessary care to patients and to make progress through that significant backlog of screening tests, surgeries, regular routine care. A lot of chronic diseases management has just fallen by the wayside. This is your heart disease, your cancers, your diabetes. We haven't had the time as a healthcare system to look after them. The other challenge, which I think a lot of us have been talking about in the last 2 days, I forgot yesterday was a pre-conference, but the last 2 days, is the global deficit of social and economic justice. And I'll give you 3 examples to illustrate this global deficit. So the 10 richest men in the world, and the 10 richest people in the world do happen to be men, so I'm not being sexist here, they have seen their global wealth double to $1.5 trillion since the start of the global pandemic. So in the last 2.5 years, these 10 men have grown wealthier by $1.3 billion a day, while the incomes of 99% of the world's population has reduced over this time, and I believe will keep reducing due to inflation and recession. The other thing is, as I talked about the speed of vaccine development, we were fast at creating it and producing a viable vaccine, but it was not matched by the speed of delivery. At the moment, 62% of the global population is fully vaccinated with 2 doses, but this varies greatly. In high-income countries, it's 74%. Middle-income countries, 56%. Low-income countries, 17%. There's a huge inequality. And in Australia, I can say this because I worked and I was involved with the vaccine rollout, 96% of the adult population is fully vaccinated with 2 doses, and 38% have had 4 doses. And I admit I have had all 4 doses, but then I reflect on my privilege of having 4 doses when a lot of my colleagues in low-income countries haven't had a single dose. This disparity in access has been one of the greatest failures of international cooperation during the COVID-19 pandemic, without a doubt. And even moving on, even our field of global health is extraordinarily unequal. with privileged people and institutions in the global north dominating all aspects of global health. In fact, a majority of global health agencies are headquartered in the US and Europe. Most global health conferences are held in these countries. And one form of privilege that people in high-income countries take for granted is the passports and visa privilege we carry. How for us, it takes about a couple of hours of filling out a form online to get our visas. And that we think is a lot of work. But for our colleagues in low middle income countries, it takes months. I think the pandemic has worsened the inequities in global travel, making the playing field treacherously uneven. A lot of our colleagues and conference participants were not able to attend today in person simply because of the passport they held. So the ones who are in this room are very privileged. We are privileged in the sense we've all have had more than 2 doses of the COVID vaccine. We are privileged that we have the right to travel, the ease of traveling, and we should never we should always think about the privilege we have. Now I'm going to move to 2 slightly different challenges that face us in the new normal. And these are more existential challenges. Antibiotic resistance. It is rising to dangerously high levels in all parts of the world. We've forgotten about it in the last 2.5 years. And it's putting the achievements of modern medicine at risk. Organ transplantations, chemotherapy, surgeries will become much more dangerous without effective antibiotics for the prevention and treatment of infections. And it's for something that is so big and literally affects modern medicine, it's not even in the SDGs. There's not a single SDG about antibiotic resistance, despite the fact it will make modern medicine redundant. The next and more serious, just as serious or more serious, is climate change, which is the single biggest threat facing humanity. And while no one is safe from these risks, but again, it's the justice issue. The people whose health is being harmed first and worst by the climate crisis are the people who contribute least to its causes and who are least able to protect themselves and their families against it. It is people in low and middle income countries. It's people in disadvantaged countries. It's the disadvantaged communities in the high income countries. And there is a great risk that the climate crisis will undo the last 50 years of progress in development, global health, poverty reduction, and would further widen existing health inequalities between and within populations. So these are the 4 challenges, I think. And the reason I chose these 4, I know there are lots of challenges. I'm sure there are lots of people out there saying, oh, no, you've forgotten this, that, but I chose these 4 because these are complex challenges. They're not a one solution challenge. These are complex challenges. And they require global and local action, which I think is what TUFH does. It also requires intersectoral collaboration. It cannot be done by the healthcare system alone. We have to work with other people, but we will face the consequences as a healthcare system with these 4 challenges, but we need to work with others. And it's also, these 4 challenges require community solidarity. So how do we build back better? As I said, I don't have the answers. And I like to draw upon Grayling's law. And the reason is, he's a philosopher. And if you look at the first one where it says, anything that can be done will be done if it brings advantage or profit to those who can do it. Unfortunately, with the 4 challenges that I have presented, they do not belong in this category. They belong in the inverse category. What can be done will not be done if it brings costs, economic or otherwise, to those who can stop it. Now, it's important to acknowledge that there are these challenges, and there will be a lot of ways in which people will get in the way of building back better, in solving these challenges. And it's generally people with power, people with money, because they don't want things to change. They don't suffer the consequences of these challenges or of these changes. And we are at a flux point where we could change things, but it's also really, really easy to fall back into what we know, what was done before. So we need to ensure that change is conscious and we are working on it and it's front on mind and we are doing it with intention. Because it's very easy to make it somebody else's issue. We all know all our governments have these beautiful documents on building back better, return to new normal, how AI is going to transform the way we work. They've got all these documents and we think, okay, our job's done. I might put in a submission, but we need to take an active role. I've been contemplating on this and I've been spent the last few months listening and learning in terms of how do I reframe and actively choose the lens I wish to view the world in. And this diagram, it's something I came up with, and it's more like a guiding principle for me, and hopefully it helps other people. It's to guide actions, but also it helps me assess the actions of others, be it our institutions, our governments, our organizations, or our businesses. There are three big components, which I call the more like guiding principles that I use in my decision-making and assessing other people's decision-making. I think I've deserved that right to judge other people, judge other organizations. The first one is trust. I think we've been talking a lot about trust in the last 2 days, and it's important. It's so important that the recent studies have shown that COVID mortality rates were directly correlated with institutional trust, that is trust in our governments, in science, in media, in health systems, but also interpersonal trust. So trust in our neighbors, in our communities, and in other people doing the right thing. And countries and regions which showed low institutional, low interpersonal trust had much higher rates of mortality and higher rates of hospitalizations. And they were less likely to follow social distancing, mask wearing, and things like that. So we need to ensure the actions of others. So when we're looking at these documents, or when we're looking at other actions or our own actions, are we building trust? Are we nurturing trust? Or are we destroying trust? Or are we minimizing trust? I think a lot of times we all say trust is important, but do we really look at how we individually, how our organizations, how our communities foster trust? The second principle for me is about purpose. Why do I do what I do? Does everybody here do what they do? A lot of times it is, I think TUFH is a special group, and that's why I've been with it for 3 years, because everybody here's purpose is about equity, reducing inequality, social accountability, community engagement. But I think we need to put that front in mind when we're doing things and when we're working with people. What is their purpose? What are their values? I always say, work with people whose values and purpose mirror yours, because that's where you get the greatest change. You have to work with the others, but be aware that their purpose and their values may not be the same. And the last one is interconnectedness. I was touched yesterday when Shane Point, the knowledge keeper who presented yesterday and mentioned the Coastal Salish word, Natsumat, I hope I'm pronouncing it properly, we are one. Because I think that sums up interconnectedness perfectly. When he was talking, I was thinking, he saw my slides, kind of thing. But I think that we are one concept is so true, because one thing that's been clear, we are more connected than we ever thought. We're connected with each other, within our communities, within our regions, globally, but we're also connected with the natural world. Anybody who doesn't think we're interconnected has to go. I think we were talking the other day about how we have all realized with the war in Ukraine that that's where a lot of sunflower oil comes from, cooking oil. It's that interconnected. You could be on the other end of the planet and your cooking oil comes from Ukraine, and because of the war, it's now impossible to get sunflower oil. It shows the interconnectedness of our global world. But also it shows we are also, with the climate change, with the recent weather events, even the heat wave right now I've been led to believe this is a heat wave in Vancouver. Right now, It shows us how we're connected with the natural world. So we need to ensure we are not working in silos and we view it from a systems point of view. We see those connections. If you're working in homelessness, what else is connected? There's a lot of mental health issues, there's housing, there is social determinants of health. We need to see the interconnectedness. There is culture, there is safety, there's a lot of things. Now, what does this mean in practice? I truly believe that change happens when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things. And sometimes it's not that extraordinary either. So no one has to develop a new vaccine here. I think sometimes it starts with four simple steps. Engage. We have to engage with our communities. We have to engage with our patients. We have to engage with our decision makers. We even have to engage with people who we do not like. Kind of thing. We have to engage with people who we do not share values and purpose. Because if we don't engage with them, we're not having the same conversation. We're not going to instill change without engaging with everyone. And today we've heard a lot about listening. And I think that is so true that we have to listen. We have to be quiet, we have to be silent, and we have to listen. I think yesterday in our group in community engagement, you mentioned about the 10 cups of tea worth of listening. And I think that is so true, that we need to keep our mouths shut, drink 10 cups of tea and listen. And we need to listen to learn, not to debate, not to persuade, not to convince the other, but listen to understand and learn. And lastly, we have to act. As academics, teachers, students, researchers, which I think is the majority of people in here, not all, but majority, we are sometimes very hesitant to act, and we prefer to be in the background. We would always say, we'll write it up as a journal article and publish it. That's our action. Or we'll teach a class or run a workshop. That's our action, kind of thing. And we go, I've done my bit. We need to do more. We need to act with intention, and we need to be part of the community, engage, listen, learn, but actually act. A lot of times we do the first three, and then we publish it in a journal article, kind of thing. We need to go beyond that. To sum up, yes, we are living in challenging times, but experience has shown there will always be obstacles, but there's always hope. People who in the name of power will put spokes in the wheels of justice, in the wheels of equity. And these days, their voices are growing louder. That's why our concerted principled efforts are vital. To come together by looking to build and advance, to fight for our common humanity, to fight for human rights, and to persevere in our commitment to health for all, in the name of dignity and equity for all. I know everyone here will play a crucial role in addressing these challenges, but I would like to suggest to take an active role and not take a back seat and leave it to others. I leave you with this quote, which says, either we make choices and accept the challenge of living them out, or the choices will be made for us, too late for us to have any say in the matter. Do not leave these important choices to others to act on your behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabia, for an inspiring, informative, eye-opening, reflective presentation on what do we do? How do we build a better together? I want to turn to the floor and see if there is any burning questions at the beginning. I see one immediate. Tamasha's coming with a microphone.
Hi, Tim Dubé from the University of Sherbrooke. Thank you very much. I have to read something from Nelson Mandela. In Africa, there is a concept known as Ubuntu, the profound sense that we are human only through the humanity of others, that if we are to accomplish anything in this world, it will in equal measure be due to the work and achievement of others. The reason why I raised that is to make the link to what was shared with us this morning. The importance of valuing different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing. And I was struck by the comment that you made about how quickly the research with vaccination emerged at the same time of a tsunami of misinformation and disinformation. And I too consider myself a slow scientist. And slow science is good science. So I would like you to perhaps share your perspective about the importance of recognizing different ways of knowing and different ways of seeing in order to ensure that the trust and reciprocity and relationships are perpetual, are sustained, as opposed to the race to who's the first to do something.
No, thank you. I think that's a really interesting point you raise. I think that's why I think you can only build trust if you understand the other person's point of view, and that there are different ways of knowing, there are different ways of seeing, there are different ways of doing. And I think that's quite key in terms of, and I think a lot of times we don't listen enough. We don't try to understand. We kind of think we other people. We kind of think, oh, that's their way of doing things. There's nothing to learn, kind of thing. And that is right across the spectrum. I know as a slow scientist myself, I know a lot of times at the beginning of my career, I was very quick to put community engagement in what would the community know, and kind of not realizing the value that communities bring, the values of different ways of seeing and knowing. And I think it's been a journey for me myself in terms of how do you incorporate all of that. And so I think it's really, and I think that's a really important concept, that there's not one way of doing things. And sometimes slow is good, because you do need to have those 10 cups of tea if you're going to listen. And I think that is why with the disinformation and misinformation that occurred, it was because as public health practitioners, as epidemiologists, as scientists, we were not listening to our communities. We were not listening to the people who felt betrayed as they were losing jobs, as they didn't get to work from home, they were getting sick. Why would they believe us? Because we never took the time to build those relationships earlier on.
Very important discussion. I do want to right now turn to our virtual moderator and give the ones online a voice. Are there any questions? No. Okay. Then here back to the floor. Are there any other? Yes.
Hi, my name is Antoine. I'm from Ottawa, here in Canada. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very, very helpful to get your sense of the pandemic and its impact. I want to come back. You mentioned purpose, and I'm hoping you can perhaps give me a bit of hope, because I'm filled with cynicism at the moment. How can we hope to build back differently or build back better if the impact of COVID-19 was to reinforce the existing power structures, if it was to reinforce the power of people who had power before and have more now? It feels like the job to build back better is even harder now than it was even before the pandemic. You mentioned a lot of the impact of COVID-19 on, say, the supply chain. We're still not moving toward warehousing more goods. We're still not moving away from this instant supply chain that failed during the pandemic. We're still not moving toward profit taxes. We're really, and my perspective is very Canadian-centric as well, so please add on to it. I would love that. We're not moving toward profit taxes. We have the highest inflation right now, and yet corporations in Canada are declaring record profits more than ever. So there's an issue here that governments have not addressed. You did mention the impact of science, but it feels, at least again from a Canadian perspective, that the biggest impact on the measures, on lifting the measures for COVID, was not science, it was not vaccination rate, it was not any data, it was elections, provincial or anticipated federal elections. Communities feel in several ways more divided than ever. We did mention the disinformation that's scoured communities, at least here, perhaps less elsewhere. So yeah, perhaps give me some hope. I do accept the statement that we have to act out, we have to move, and we have to take responsibility. But at the same time, it feels like the challenge is now greater than it ever was. So please give me hope. And as an aside, thank you for Galen's Law. I was not aware of Galen's Law. I'm going to use it a lot now. Thank you.
Not a problem. No, thank you. No, thank you for your insights. I think there is hope, because what the pandemic showed was 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, if you said all conferences were going to go online or hybrid, nobody would have believed you. Nobody would have, they would be like, oh, that's just too difficult. We can't do hybrid conferences. We can't do online conferences. So it kind of pushed people to think differently. So I think that's where the hope was. And it also pushed some governments. I'm not sure what the Canadian government did here, but a lot of governments, I must say a lot of governments in high income countries did put in measures in place to for instance, not electricity, rent, mortgage payments. Tenants couldn't be evicted. So it showed us that, I think that's where the hope comes. Yes, it took a pandemic to get those things, but it showed us there was a way possible. And in the sense, like even in the new Australian Sydney context, the fact that they housed every single homeless person in a hotel showed that we can solve homelessness magically with lockdown. Pandemic occurred, lockdown occurred, there was no longer homelessness because there was a will and was prioritized. Unfortunately, that's gone back. So I think that's what provides me hope, that we've seen some things can work. If there is enough will, it can work, but I think it requires us to be more vigilant, to actually make that noise. And I think that's what happened during the pandemic. There was a lot of noise being made, and I think there was also fear. But I think for the first time, the health sector was being listened to, not in all countries, but usually we're never listened to. So it was quite a big change that the Premier, for instance, in our state, was actually listening to health advice. I think before that, never really did, kind of thing. So I think that's where I see where the hope is, that there is something that can be done. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think the structural racism, the institutional racism, it's not new. It's been happening for decades. But I think with the new social media, the new technologies, it just kind of went global. It went viral in a slightly different context across the world. I know of tiny, small towns in Australia and New Zealand were having Black Lives Matter marches, and it also made us reflect on the high incarceration rates and death in custody rates of Aboriginal Australians and Maori in New Zealand. It actually brought up those conversations. So those things were always happening, but for some reason there was that coalescence that made it become more evident. And I think for a lot of people, it's made non-health people realize the impact of social determinants of health. So I think that's where I'm hopeful that we can change. And if we saw the things that could be done, some of them still are problems, but I think it gives us hope that it can be done. It's not impossible.
I hope that sparked some more hope. I know that we already have a question here, and then your question, Bill.
Rabia, thank you so very, very much for a very powerful, heartfelt presentation. And thank you for your invitation that you've given all of us in terms of that, yes, we can, and for giving us that hope as well. One of the things as a helper and a healer that I'm very concerned about is I know that we have to do, and I know for all of us there's lots to do, but we have to remember that we cannot give away what we don't have. In order for us to be able to do this work that must be done, we must also come home to ourselves. We must be able to take good care of ourselves. We must be able to really be able to hold space for each other and for one another. I'm a psychotherapist, and I work mainly with Indigenous peoples, and particularly during this time, it was horrific. But just several weeks ago, I gave a presentation to some doctors, and I was asked by the OMA. And many of those doctors, and it was about self-care and holding space for each other and holding space for one another, and how we take good care of ourselves while we move forward to do this vital and very, very important work. Many of them were despondent. Many of them cried. Many of them said, I don't know if I want to continue to be in this profession because we are confronted with a broken system. But I think what I would like to highlight is that, yes, I know I have hope, great hope, as you have, but we also have to make sure that we do take that time, all of us as helpers and healers, to do that self-care, to be present for ourselves as well, because we cannot give away what we don't have. In order for us to give it, we need to have it ourselves and understand it ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you for that insight. And I totally agree with you. During the pandemic, I remember we were all working crazy hours and getting quite overwhelmed and stressed. And our boss basically said, you need to put your oxygen mask first, then you can help others. And basically told us, go home, it's 2 a.m. No one's going to be looking at their phones for their close contact text message. But I think that's so important. And I think after 2.5 years, a lot of the healthcare workforce, a lot of the healers, we are tired, we're exhausted. And I think it's so important to look after ourselves, do the self-care, look after each other so that we're ready for the next. We're ready to confront these challenges and ensure that we build back better. Thank you.
I think that's a very important message for all of us. I know we are running almost out of time, but I know Bill has an urgent question. So if community does not mind, we will stay 1 more minute for Bill.
It's not that urgent, but maybe it is. Rabia, thank you so much for a brilliant, brilliant talk. I think this is a template for anyone giving a keynote. Excellent, exquisite slides. You told us exactly what you were going to tell us. You told us what you were going to tell us. You summarized what you're... Brilliant talk. 2 comments. I am reminded of, by your talk about, or your comments about community, a lovely book by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler called Connected: The Surprising Power of Social Networks. Very readable, and it talks about the influence that we all have on people that are not just connected by being sort of 1 step away, not just connected by 2 steps, but as many as 3 steps away, we have the ability to influence others. And it's actually genetically embedded. He's got some nice chapters on that. So Connected, the social power, the surprising power of social networks. The other book I was reminded of was Adam Grant's book called Think Again, which is all about listening and all about not trying to convince the other, not trying to be the advocate or the preacher or the prosecutor, but rather being the scientist and talking to others as you would if you were a scientist, trying to learn and understand the other. So 2 great books. And finally, those books, by the way, are books that we have read together as part of a global book group that I started about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And if anyone's interested in joining that, I would just say to contact me. But it's been a group of people from around the world that reads books, always nonfiction, related to many of the topics that you have so brilliantly outlined today. So we are so fortunate to have you as part of TUFH. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you, everyone.